Hi and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. And a very warm welcome to our xChange webinar about demurrage and detention, specifically building upon our recent report about demurrage and detention trends in 2022, how to navigate them. And we're joined here by two industry-leading experts, Chantal McRoberts and George Griffiths, from Drewry and S&P Global, respectively, and our very own Candice, who was the author of that report. My name is Christian. I'm one of the two co-founders and co-CEOs of Container xChange, and I'll be your host and moderator. Before we start and kick off, just want to wait 1 or 2 more minutes for some late joiners to come in. And join the webinar. And while we wait, maybe some housekeeping. On the right-hand side in your screen, you'll see a chat box where Valeria has kindly already posted the first message. You can use this to introduce yourself, start networking, write your comments on the topics that we're discussing, or on your general view on the shipping industry. And there's also a second sort of option, which is called polls. And there is a sort of a quick poll there to get to know you all better with a few questions. So would love for you to answer those, just so we can also tailor the webinar and any future webinars to your interests. And then lastly, there is a questions tab on the right-hand side. Please feel free to use that extensively to ask questions to any one of our speakers or to the sort of panel as a whole, and then we'll go into answering those questions at the end of the webinar. Now I'm going to pause here, maybe wait another 30 seconds. I still see the attendee or attendance counter ticking up, so let's maybe give 1 or 2 more moments for any late joiners. Great, then let's kick this off. For those of you who have just joined, a very warm welcome to you as well. We're going to kick off our webinar now. My name is Christian. I'm one of the two co-founders and co-CEOs of xChange, and I'll be hosting this webinar. And we're doing this in Miro. So this is it's almost like an online whiteboard solution. You'll see how we navigate through the webinar. It's designed to be as interactive as possible. So please do make use of it. And I see the chat on the right-hand side already lighting up. So that's a very good sign. Perfect. Candice, if you just want to move down a little. What are we talking about today? Demurrage and detention, of course. We'll use we use our very own demurrage detention trends report from earlier this month as a starting point. We'll dive a little bit into demurrage detention trends in 2022 versus 21 and 2020. We'll discuss forecasts for the rest of the year. We'll talk about differences in demurrage and detention across ports, regions, shipping lines, and of course, we'll make ample use of our expert panelists from S&P Global and Drewry, George and Chantal, who I'll be introducing in a minute. Very important to me is let's make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to add your comments, ask your questions as much as you can. The more the merrier, and the more value we generate for all of you, I guess. Now, without further ado, let's talk about who we have here in the group today. I already spoke briefly about myself. That's always the easiest part. And we'll also have Candice join from the xChange team, who was the author of our Demurrage and Detention report. And then we are very, very honored and lucky to have two industry-leading experts from Drewry and S&P Global join us today. We'll have Chantal and McRoberts, who's head of advisory at Drewry Supply Chain Advisors, vast experience in the maritime and container shipping sector, worked also in the liner shipping industry for a number of players in trade management and operational roles, and has now been with Drewry for a number of years. Super excited to have you, and very much looking forward to your viewpoints.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Nice to see everybody dialing in and popping in the chat.
Yes. And then we have George Griffiths, who is managing editor of Global Container Freight at S&P Global Commodity Insights. A big focus in his work is on global container freight markets, really providing you and all his readers and subscribers with transparency and superior intelligence on the entire supply chain. And we're super excited to have you here and contribute your insights into demurrage and detention, but of course also overarching global shipping trends. Excited to have you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you. And always great to be in such esteemed company. Thank you.
Perfect. Cool. Then let's maybe dive in. I said we wanted to make this as interactive as possible. So what you'll see here, to everybody who's new to Miro, is our online whiteboard with sticky notes for all of our speakers and attendees, and even a color for myself. So I can also drop a comment here and there if I have something interesting to add. And we have basically three areas we want to talk about. It's the pandemic-induced spike of demurrage and detention charges. What's the current situation? Where does it come from, etc. That's the first block. Then we'll look into the data a little bit more detailed. And then lastly, we'll have an outlook on the future, some solutions. What can shippers and forwarders do to manage demurrage and detentions better? And then, of course, followed by a Q&A block, Q&A sector, where we would like to answer all of the questions that come up during this webinar. Cool. Without any further ado, and maybe we start with you, George. If you look at the past 2 years, of course, 2.5 years actually, significantly impacted by COVID. How has COVID overall impacted demurrage and detention? Is there anything that we can look at, sort of the situation? How did that come from?
Yeah, I mean, as we know, the pandemic's thrown up many issues for the container freight market, right? I mean, amongst other sectors of the supply chain, the real issues. People have faced high container rates, crippling delays in the system, and then demurrage and detention is just an added cost on top of that now. So we've really seen some pandemic-induced imbalances of both loaded and empty containers around the world, and that's brought these issues to the forefront of the market. And so on top of the hefty freight rates, which have peaked almost 10 times the pre-COVID freight rate levels from Asia to Europe at least, we've started to see shippers really struggle with these increasing fees for containers that have been stuck in port and returned late, in a situation that for many shippers is really beyond their control. As a result of this equipment imbalance that we've seen around the world, significant shortages and delays at some point highlighted, I think it was 107 or 109 ships in the San Pedro Bay offshore California in January this year. Many carriers, many operators have introduced strict free time parameters, I suppose would be a better word for it. And as a result, these charges have been levied against the shippers for delays, and they've become a really significant cost center for these shippers. Previously, this was a transient cost. People didn't really look at it. People didn't really pay that much attention to demurrage and detention. But now it's become quite a thorny issue, I think. It's true, really, in the US. Nowhere is this quite as true. Anecdotally, somebody told me that they had 10 free days pre-COVID, and this was reduced to 6 free days sort of during the pandemic. But their container was tied up in the port for 13 weeks. So that's quite significantly hefty charges that have been levied against them, right? But there's not much that you can do in that situation. We have a lack of truckers, we have a lack of rail cars. It's difficult to deal with this, and so it's really been at the front of people's minds. But I think pre-pandemic, some of these practices were fairly rare, or at least in the mid 20-teens, 2013, 14. But now we're seeing detention and demurrage charges somewhere around $100 per container in some instances, and that's on a per DM basis. So it really does start to add up, especially if very few people are just moving one container. Once you start to multiply that number through, it really becomes quite a big issue, I think. Gotcha. Makes sense.
And Candice, is that something that we can back up with our own data?
Yes, gladly. While you're taking notes, Christian, I'm just going to toggle the screen down to some actual pages from our report. So, sorry, just trying to minimize the screen here. Specifically, in 2021, when we did our report last year, we noticed that there was a massive increase in demurrage and detention trends year on year. So if you look at this yellow bar here, that represents 2021, and you can see how in most ports in the world, 2021 showed a major spike in these charges. In fact, I think the global average increase was 39% for standard containers alone, because those are the only containers we looked at. But it's okay because they're the most popular container type, so they hint at a proper global trend. And the charges for 20 DCs alone doubled in 2021. So to back up what George said, we really did see a massive spike in 2021. And then if we look at what the state is today in 2022, if you look again at this graph, you'll see that a lot of graphs, the trend in 2022 is decreasing slightly. For some other ports, some outliers like Long Beach and Los Angeles and Shanghai, they actually increased. So that ended up with the value in 2022 still being higher than 2020's value, or the pre-pandemic value, by 12%. So even today, the spike is still pretty much there.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. And George, we sort of you briefly touched upon demurrage and detention charges, also sort of in the context of I'd say sort of strained overall logistics markets and high freight rates. What's if you look at freight rates now, what's the current state of the market according to your freight rate index and your data?
To put it in one word, high is the answer, but to put it in a couple more words, not as high as it was. So the Platts Container Index, which is the weighted index of our different head haul and back haul assessments that we have, is about 400% above where it was at this time in 2019, which is a significant cost. And so when we're talking about debt and dem on top of that, it does start to really impact people on people's pockets, especially on the shipper side. They've come off the boil a little bit in recent months, the container rates. Shanghai lockdown, everyone thought was going to be a bullish impetus for the market, but just never really was. We just saw rates continually erode. And this is really coming off the record high demand levels that we had in Europe and in the US. But this fall's quite interesting. We're moving into the peak season. The peak season is typically when people start to move their goods from Asia to Europe or the US ahead of Christmas. I know it seems like a long way away, but we always forget, or I think we're sometimes guilty of forgetting, these aren't instantaneous moves. There is always a little bit of a lag time. We are moving things around the world. And although we're all on Twitter, the world is a very large place. And so the issues that we're seeing going into peak season, inventory levels are very high in Europe and North America. We're starting to see people drop down quite a bit in terms of their new orders. Also, the world is pretty expensive right now. Fuel's through the roof. We're seeing rampant inflation. People are tightening their belts and closing their wallets somewhat. So on one side, you have a big drawdown in terms of demand. On the other side, the carriers and the operators are employing void sailing, so they're taking vessels out of their strings to try and keep rates high, and also keep that balance between supply and demand. And many really expected there to be a bullwhip when Shanghai reopened. It was closed for 2 months. Didn't really happen, and so there's always that little question at the back. Where did the demand go? And we're seeing people saying, oh, well, rates will go up in August, but these are the same people who said rates will go up in April or May or mid-May, June, July. So it's a constant sort of optimistic market on both sides. And I think despite this optimism that the rates will rise or stay flat on the carrier side, not the optimism on the shipper side that they'll come back down, our analysts here at S&P are saying that we're kind of going to see it stay more or less flat for the rest of the year. A little bit of variance here, a touch downside maybe, but in the grand scheme of things, flat. And we're not going to see a fall off the cliff to the extent that we saw it rise when it did in 2020 and 2021. So all of these additional factors, despite showing some downside, it's not really that cliff edge to mirror what we saw in the last couple of years, and it's only further hindered by those additional costs of detention and demurrage, that shipping is now a lot more expensive.
Yeah, so certainly a sort of challenging environment to navigate. And in light of this sort of overall market development, how then have these increased demurrage and detention fees impacted the industry as a whole, or specifically carriers or freight forwarders in Europe, US, China, or globally?
If we look at, I think US markets are the best one to really highlight this. They're not quite as diverse as the European sides. And carriers have been really incentivized to keep a tight leash on their equipment due to high freight costs, strong demand, and log-jammed intermodal networks, I think would be a good way of phrasing it. And it's of course well within their purview. They've taken the cost of the containers on board. They need to have these goods, need to have them back, right? It's not like dry bulk or tankers when you make a delivery, you're left with a free ship. You need to be able to reposition the containers. And I think that's an important nuance in the container market. And so especially when you're trying to get those containers back, if you're making $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for a 40-foot container, you want that back as soon as possible. So that's why we're starting to see these costs increase on detention and demurrage, I think. But it's, of course, simply put, detention and demurrage are designed to compensate carriers for the use of their containers. There's no other way about it. And they're just that incentive to move them back, as I say. And this was really highlighted for us, or at least from my side, in February 2021. Some carriers on Europe to North Asia, so the backhaul route, refused to take loaded containers back to North Asia because they wanted that quick turnaround. And so that doesn't quite feed into the, you're not going to be penalized for that, but it does add more fuel to the fire of what we're talking about. And shippers are wary of incurring unavoidable costs, I think. They've trended towards interior point intermodal systems, intermodal shipments, away from that, instead booking more on a port-to-port basis. And freight forward NVOs, logistics outfits, whoever it may be, they've had a hard time securing drayage, trucking providers, things like that, due to market constraints, chassis and rail car shortages, as I spoke about earlier. And this has led them to provide a little bit more emphasis on truck moves, I think, dedicated more resources to the inland leg. But that's not a perfect solution. We have a finite number of chassis. The more you're focusing on the inland leg, we move a little bit away from sort of the port movements there. So it's that first mile. So sort of one hand gives and the other one takes away, is I think the way that the market's looking at it at the moment.
Gotcha. And sort of so here we mostly talk about sort of, I guess, the disruptions of the sort of logistics supply chain. You talked about sort of intermodal traffic, scarcity of truckers, et cetera. How does this all play together with sort of availability of containers? Because just recently, there's also sort of new data coming out, actually by Drewry, focused on sort of the global size, or the size of the global container fleet, and stating that we now have 6 million TEU in circulation, more than we did at the onset of the pandemic. How does this, like, how should we think about this increase in container availability or container supply in light of all these challenges?
I think it's important to recognize that equipment shortages increase the relative value of containers, right? It's subject, pre-pandemic, it was assumed that wherever you wanted to ship, there'd be a container. You could just put it on the container and it would be fine. And containers themselves are actually subject now to their own supply and demand to views. They're a tertiary commodity. And just, I'm going to preempt your question of what do you mean by tertiary commodity on that side. That it functions I view shipping as a secondary commodity, right? It functions only to move other goods and commodities around the world. without the need to move those commodities or whatever goods they are, there is no shipping demand. And this has been acutely seen in the last couple of months and the last couple of years. When you, as you're a carrier or a freight forwarder, if you lower your rates, you can take market share from competitors, but you can't drive up new demand. We've never gone onto Amazon buying whatever we want, a toaster, should we say, and thought, oh, look, the shipping is free, let's buy 2 toasters. It doesn't work that way, but it does work the other way. When rates are fairly high, people think, oh, well, maybe I don't want to spend £30 on a toaster and £50 on freight for it. But actually, that's been the logic that people have always run with. And I'm not sure it's quite true that when rates in 2021 spiked so significantly, demand stays strong because people still need to eat, they need to clothe themselves, they need goods. And with lots of us working from home, people needed to redo their kitchen or paint their walls to save their own sanity, things like that. And so the more of an imbalance that these things make, the firmer, the more charges will be levied at ports and destinations for detention and demurrage against containers that aren't where they should be. And it's also worth noting that, within the US, high ports and inland terminal congestion, LA Long Beach had really big issues. Charleston and Savannah at the moment are just oscillating between who's got the bigger queue. Kansas City rail hub inland, lots of inland containers were tied up for weeks at a time, a rail hub not able to get on the next rail cars. And so this has really resulted in a groundswell of high demurrage charges that we're seeing in the market. And these latest practices have come onto the radar of regulatory officials. Many cargo owners are starting to bring complaints towards the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission in the US.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, very interesting. And I do see that correlation. It's actually also something that we see on xChange, not within the report, but actually on our xChange sort of trading and leasing platform. The more sort of logistics disruptions are there that cause container turnaround times to increase and container fleet efficiency to decrease, the higher the rates are, both on the trading side as well as on the leasing side. So it's almost there's a direct correlation there. It's very interesting to observe, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the coming months. Cool, super interesting. Maybe moving on to the sort of, I guess, the data deep dive area of topic of our webinar, and moving to you, Candice, as the author. You already highlighted some of the sort of headline figures in terms of overall sort of global D&D levels. What are other main global findings from the report that you could highlight?
Let me just go again, scroll down to
You prepared something that's cheating, but I'll let you get away with it.
So as already mentioned, global demurrage and detention fees dropped a little bit year on year this year, but it's still pretty high. And there were 8 ports this year where the D&D charges actually increased. These were Jebel Ali, Long Beach, Los Angeles, Ningbo, Qingdao, Shanghai, Singapore, and Tianjin. So that was quite interesting to see, especially with all the ports in the US being really, really exorbitant in those fees. And the top 5 places where we ranked, all of the ports were taken up by US ports, which was interesting to see, and must have a correlation with all the log jams that are happening there. So that was interesting. We also saw that the lowest D&D charges were Busan, Yichang, Rugao, and Zhenjiang. So it was just interesting to see the variety of fees across regions and ports, as well as shipping lines. We found that Costco has the lowest charges out of all the 8 shipping lines we looked at, while Yangming has the highest. So those were kind of like a very brief wrap up of the 5 global takeaways.
Okay, very interesting. And via region, if we look at China, because you mentioned it as well, what are the main findings there?
Yeah. Actually, I should have just stayed down here. So China was interesting because, as stated, Shanghai and Ningbo and Qingdao, they had an increase in demurrage and detention, whereas Hong Kong and pretty much all the others decreased slightly. So there was quite a roller coaster ride in China, especially with the lockdowns that happened, which, I think Chantal might have some more info on, but the lockdown didn't help the situation in China, and the charges are still pretty high collectively in China as well this year.
Okay, very interesting. And Chantal, maybe then we always had the perfect segue from Candice there. What's the effect of those lockdowns?
So the zero COVID policy has been an interesting one to watch from obviously a freight weight perspective, from a demand perspective, from a supplies perspective as well. And it really has had a mixed bag of impacts on all of the big drivers of demand within the industry, and detention and demurrage is no exception to that. Basically, with the lockdowns, there was a shortage of drivers, which further disrupted the disrupted supply chain. And this is the key to all of this. It's disruption, driving an increase in detention and demurrage charges. Obviously, if there's a shortage of drivers, there's a shortage of physical people and vehicles to get the containers into the ports and out of the ports. So it consequently increases the D&D charges. Obviously, I spend most of my time these days providing therapy to shippers, I think is the best way of describing this, whether it be freight rates or detention and demurrage, and everybody is focusing on these cost items. And, unfortunately, if you're a shipper right now, your CFO is looking at all the bills and the invoices coming in and saying, why am I paying for this? Why am I paying for this? And unfortunately, it's physical blockages driving this up, particularly in, China with the lockdown situation. It is easing. Hopefully next year will be a slightly better picture on this charge front, but we will have to wait and see.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. And I can definitely sort of understand the therapy part that rings true. Okay, cool. And Candice, if we move from China Trans-Pacific, of course, sort of on the other side of that big Trans-Pacific trade, we see the US. What are some of the key findings there?
So as stated, the most expensive ports were all in the US. But what we also found interesting, and sorry to toggle back to my cheat sheet down here, is that the demurrage charges increased for Los Angeles and Long Beach and New York, whereas the detention fees decreased. So we found that quite interesting once we dissected them and pull them apart to really see what was going on there and try come up with a reason for why demurrage went up while detention went down.
And why do you think that is?
Well, actually, I was going to ask Chantal as our expert next.
So it goes back, and it feels, the narrative is the same. It's congestion. That's what's been driving the demurrage costs. These are heavily congested ports and the subsequent terminals, and they have been for a very long time. We're tracking this through AIS data and Drewry, and everything is still in the red. Nothing is moving into the amber, and if it is, it's at the upper end of the amber, still about to tip into the red side. And we're seeing that still continuing at the large US ports. So, obviously what that creates is, difficulties in moving things on and off dock, which is then driving up the demurrage, shortage of drivers, again, linking, labour shortages is a massive issue, not just in the US and in Europe as well. And obviously, as soon as they are available, then the shippers are desperate to get the cargo. We go back to this point about building up inventory levels. Obviously, we saw all the major shippers doing that. They were pushing up their inventories. So as and when they could eventually get their containers off the port or off dock, they got them back to their warehouses and site facilities. They emptied them and they got the containers back as soon as they can if they had drivers available. So that is how they've managed to keep that part of it as a slightly lower cost. I'm not going to say that it's been a massive saving for them. They've been driving that. They still have been sort of hit with costs at both ends, but one is slightly less than the other, and it's because they've been able to control that part of the supply chain. Obviously, the congestion side coming into the ports with the vessels they've had no control over.
Gotcha. So just this was a lot of content. Let me just quickly note this down. I think I hope I got this like that. Okay. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. And what do you? I mean, I don't want to sort of put like how do you say that? Already go too much into sort of our forecast topic, but how do you see this specific trend, demurrage versus detention in the US? How do you see that developing going forward? What's the trend there?
So Drewry is tracking congestion on a weekly basis, and it will all be linked to this. Uh-huh. I would like to say that the cost element will alleviate as the congestion alleviates. And then hopefully we're back into a world where, we know we've got some latent capacity coming in next year, so that the supply-demand balance should hopefully equalize a little bit. And then if we can get, the pedal easing off the accelerator of port congestion, then hopefully that will have the positive ramifications on the cost side. I think it's very important if you're a shipper. A lot of shippers don't know or didn't know how much they were spending on this. So they really need to get into the mindset of monitoring it, tracking it, asking the questions about what you can and cannot get in your bid. We talk about freight rates, but spot rates may go in one direction, but I suspect contract rates are still going to remain high. And you need to make sure you're nailing down these days in your bids and your tenders. So, it's about maximizing any opportunity on a hopefully softening cost element. And that's where I see it going. I see it softening, but if the port congestion, particularly in the US ports, doesn't ease up, and if it falls into secondary ports, the East Coast ports, for example, then you may see it going up in those locations. So it's very location specific, which I think your data is showing. Actually, you can see, the trend across. If you were to map that chart with high levels of port congestion, you would easily see where what's driving that.
Yes. Yeah, very interesting, and I mean that's also what we see also in terms of vessel waiting times and berth windows, etc. That now sort of the US East Coast ports are really struggling, and we'll see congestion there. So no doubt that will very likely show up also in our next Demurrage and Detention report in terms of trends.
I think just to jump in, something else that we haven't touched upon yet that's caused a lot of problems in terms of delays at ports and things like that is the entrance of new, what we're going to call MVOCCs into the market. Lots of shippers who started charting their own ships and things like that who didn't have berth slots sort of lined up for the market, and I think that's caused a lot of further knock-on problems, especially in some of those US ports that we've seen. And I'm not going to name any companies, but it's the very large shippers that we know around the world who have entered this market, and that caused it was all done with good intentions, right? But I think it just caused a lot of further issues in the market. It caused a bit of slowdown, and we still don't have enough truckers and enough rail cars to move out. And just anecdotally, I was driving in the UK not all that long ago, and I was driving behind a truck that said, are you a qualified HGV driver? Join us. That's a heavy goods vehicle for those of you who don't speak our 3-letter acronym lingo. Are you a qualified HGV driver? Starting salary £53,000, and the average household income in the UK is somewhere around £30,000. So there's a real need to try and do that. It's not just we spend a lot of time throwing questions and throwing sort of criticism at the ocean side, but actually it's really the inland logistics and the hinterlands of the ports that are causing a lot of these problems, I think.
Yeah, well, if you were president or I don't know, chancellor of the world, what would you do to solve this or to address some of these issues? I know it's a $1 million question, but any sort of immediate thoughts or insights on what you think could be done? And I mean, you already mentioned that you'd likely focus on the hinterland side.
I mean, it's not really $1 million question, is it? It's a multi-billion-dollar question. It's so much more than that, and I think that's sort of what we're seeing. I think that we need to see more investment in the infrastructure behind the ports, and we can have all of the ritzy ports around the world that are able to take a huge amount of cargo and offload it very quickly. But if there's no highway or there's nothing like that behind it, that's where we really need to see that infrastructure. And the US have put a lot of money into this recently with their new infrastructure bill that's passed through in the last, I think, 6 months or so. And so we're going to see them investing in things like motorways and bridges, and a small proportion of that is looking at the freight side of the actual ports. But it's really the step behind. I mean, even once again, taking Los Angeles and Long Beach as an example, they built that bridge between the two of them, which has finally been completed, I think, sort of during the pandemic. And that's a step in the right direction to help out. But still, as Chantal was saying, they're in the red, or if they're not, they're in the amber. There's, even with the best will in the world, it's still struggling. But I think that's where the investment needs to go if I had unlimited time and money. But realistically,
there is a group of people that have made an awful lot of money, and that's the carriers. So they have to invest that money somewhere, and to continue to make money, they may well, I don't know, choose to invest in improving or investing in private rail. We've seen MSC do it in particular. They've been very successful in doing that in Portugal, actually, to link into its Sines port. So, there's a group out there that has a lot of money to invest. They're going to invest some in vessels. If I was trying to drive some change, I would be encouraging them to go into the inland part of the market as much as they can. Obviously, there's issues with, national rail networks and gauges and all of that. But, if there can be more open dialogue and people being more open to that kind of approaches, and it ties into, let's say, the Maersk integrator program, that could help, because obviously it means that they can move the cargo in and out more efficiently. They probably have a little bit more control, even more on the supply, demand and capacity and bottlenecks, but it might help alleviate some of the charges that the shippers are incurring because of all those congestion items. So, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what they do with their war chests.
Just to throw something sort of back in on that, though, I mean, obviously that makes the logical sense, right? And you're then torn, I think, between two things, because the order book for the container fleet is massive at the moment. We're all talking about methanol and ammonia and the future fuels and how do we decarbonize. But it makes sense, as Chantal just said, to invest in those integrated logistics to make it all work if we can with those large war chests. But without sort of without pointing any fingers, they've benefited from these delays, right? And so why would you try and fix a system that's currently helping you build up those war chests? I mean, call me a skeptic, and I'm sure I am. But when there is a lot of delays and a lot of issues in the market, that's when these guys are starting to build these large reserves in the back. So do they really want to clean up these issues all too fast? I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit too cynical.
I think we're slightly digressing, but I think yes. Right now the key is, I used to work for a carrier. I used to be in trade management. I used to be told to chase market share. I used to do it with rates. The question now in the mind of everybody is, things are ticking downwards. When you look at even our WCI, spot rates are falling, our equity index, the share prices are falling. The only thing that isn't dropping as quickly as possible is port congestion. So the carriers, how are they going to manage a drop in potential demand whilst maintaining freight rates, whilst introducing new capacity? And this is, there's not even a scale big enough to try and balance all of that. There's too many sides of it. So I think they will try to manage capacity, but I think, understand that they have to accept that the real pressure points have to be relieved, because it causes so many issues for them as well. Yeah, okay, they can put blank sailings in, they can slow steam. That's a way of controlling the capacity. But they have to have the pressure come off the massive bottlenecks, because, their customers aren't happy. And in a world where the cost of living is soaring, demand is, or let's say the economic outlook isn't great, then that often leads to this demand fall. So that's also now one of the tipping points in all of this. So it's, again, what's the buzzword? Polycrisis, I think, is what people are using now, instead of just disrupted or, hyper change. But again, we're in this another period of uncertainty, and I think it's now getting your mindset into what all the carriers do. But they will have to invest to some degree to alleviate those pressures as and where they can. And the trick is they'll only do it where it suits them. I think that is the key to all of this. So MSC absolutely wanted to drive share through Sinners, so they invested in the rail. It just made sense. So, you know, it's all about that now, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love the term polycrisis. I haven't heard this before, but I think it captures very well sort of the last 2.5 years with just one disruption or crisis piling on top of the other, be it, I don't know, Brexit, COVID, Ever Given in Suez Canal, you name it. There's just...
I'd forgotten about Brexit. That's
too many things to count, probably.
Yeah.
Cool. Super interesting, and thanks for this engaging discussion. I think this, to be honest, this is how these webinars are the most fun. So no, doesn't matter if we're digressing a little bit. Cool, and we already talked a little about sort of the future and future solutions, etc. Which is essentially was planned as our section 3 here on the right hand side. We touched a little bit on like who has an interest in resolving these issues, who has the war chest to resolve some of these issues, etc. But let's also look a little bit at what state or governments, state players or governments are doing, or government agencies. And primarily, let's look at the US. Capturing the headlines in recent weeks. Maybe the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, and the Commission continues to grapple with detention and demurrage issues and their responsibility sort of during the pandemic and limiting that. Chantal, how do you see that? Like, what in your sort of mind, what role does the FMC play? What should it play, etc.?
Oh, I think it depends where you sit. I think many shippers feel, and probably justifiably, treated really unfairly in all of this, and would definitely in the US welcome some regulations and see that they are long overdue. But I believe the FMC is maybe taking a slightly softer approach and has probably I believe I might be incorrect, has sort of absolved the carriers of any sort of wrongdoing, whereas shippers are still feeling, no, I'm paying too much for charges that are outside of my control. And we still see the carriers pushing back by, even now reducing days allowed. This whole thing now of, if somebody says to me, what should I ask for detention and demurrage? Should I put, the good old days of 21 days in? And we're like, no, they're not even going to open your tender if you do that. So I think, if it can be driven through by policy and it can be implemented, I think, on the US side, it would definitely be welcome, but I feel it's a hard thing to do. But George may have another insight into that.
No, I think you're pretty much sort of spot on with what you said there. I mean, people feel, as you say, quite rightly victimized to some degree. Everywhere you look as a shipper, you're paying something more. Be that a peak season surcharge, detention, demurrage, new increasing fuel costs because Russia and Ukraine have started a war there. So have we got to put on new emergency fuel surcharges? I mean, everywhere that we look, these guys are really struggling, I think. And so to give a bit more teeth to the FMC is. I've never won for government control on a personal level, but I think that actually in a market such as this, a little bit tighter regulation might be good. I mean, if we cast our minds back, 6-7 years now, we have TSA and all the problems that caused, and it's just sort of something that we need to remember is that back then government control came in and sort of fixed what was quite a thorny issue, and maybe it will happen again. But I think, yeah, Chantal, what you said is absolutely spot on.
Gotcha. And I mean, you were talking about sort of giving more teeth to the regulator, and both of you, I think, sort of pointed into that direction to reduce the power of some of the players in the market and create a bit more of a level playing field. If you look at sort of thinking about teeth for the FMC, and you look at the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which was recently signed into law, like, will this be enough? Will this result in improvements in port congestion, lower shipping costs, etc.? And ultimately, if we say that demurrage and detention always is positively correlated to congestion, what impact does it have on D&D charges?
I mean, I think from my side, it's still quite early to tell, what impact OSRA is going to have. What it does do is it takes the burden of proof and puts it on the carrier. That's a very useful thing, I think, because that then means that we could see more of these challenges coming from the shipping side. That's always been a reluctance, is if we try and bring something against the carrier, how do we prove it? How do we justify it? And it just gives the FMC more tools for oversight within the market, particularly as it relates to carrier practices on that side. Gradual implementation of this will obviously see gradual results. And we don't have, will it impact some of the issues that we've been speaking about earlier, port congestion, logistical challenges, things like that? Will it? Probably not, because they're subject to their own supply and demand swings, of course. But it might give carriers some pause for thought when it comes to looking at their own movements, their own operations, which could further down the line ease some of these things. I mean, there's not going to be a short-term fix. You can't just come in and change the way the market works, but it will make them slightly more reticent, perhaps, to take, just to put it back into perspective, maybe to take such strong positions on detention and demurrage. And it's been very, very welcomed, I think, from the shipper side of the market. But I'm sure Chantal has more insight from her side.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the clients that we're working with in the US, they take it with a pinch of salt, basically, because, it's a commercial world at the end of the day, and they're being, everything's being driven by a commercial force some way or another for them. So, they welcome it, but, they I think acknowledge more than anything else that they need to get a handle on what they're paying for this first, to be able to see really when the impact comes in, because a lot of them won't know, and a lot of them don't know, and some of them are too big to even be able to figure it out. We've had conversations with very, very large shippers in the US, supermarket based, who maybe don't have 100% visibility on detention and demurrage charges, and I think there's very few companies that do. So regulation is one, monitoring is another, from a sort of, again, a sort of legislative perspective, but you really need to be doing it yourselves as well. And I think, shippers, just as a point, really, the days of demanding, $1,000, I'm only going to pay $1,000 and I want my THCs and BAFs included, are long gone. You can tell I used to work on a backhaul train. But, the mindset has to shift. And we call, in my various therapy sessions, it's going through the stages of grief, and you have to accept it now, and you have to find a way to cope and move on, really. So and it was fine to be angry, and that's totally understandable.
Okay, but let's focus on that for a second. You mentioned that better monitoring, for example, of what's happening in your supply chain. What's your live status, so to speak, on demurrage and detention charges? Where are holdups in your supply chain? That's something that shippers, that industry participants can do to manage these charges. What are other things that shippers, freight forwarders, etc., can do to manage this better?
So for shippers, again, it's being very clear about what you require. It's being very clear, it's understanding what detention and demurrage is, actually. I think a lot of people aren't 100% clear on that. And they have to try to smooth their supply chains, try to sort of optimize how they're doing that. Understand the liabilities associated with all of this. Obviously, we're talking about charges, but there's contractual liabilities as well. I had one client talk about a perishable good that basically arrived so late they couldn't use it, but the carrier and it had been stuck at a port. So not only could they not use it, they got stuck with detention and demurrage charges. So it goes back to what's your contractual arrangements, what's your liabilities on that, and think about enhancing your relationships with your carriers as well. That at the moment is really a key thing, that if you can drive a strategic relationship that may well have a benefit on, you know, the more transactional elements of the things that you're doing with them, so that, you know, you can call, you know, the elusive key account manager, who can then get through to the ever more elusive trade manager to then say, can you get my box off? So that, you know, that's the kind of things that shippers should start to think about. Position yourself as what we call a shipper of choice, and requesting low amounts of detention and demurrage is definitely going to get you at the top of the pile. Think about how the carriers are looking at their own, where they've got surplus and deficits of containers. Are you moving your container into a deficit area? Because that's a key thing. Or if you're moving it into a surplus area, that, you know, that's less attractive. So it's really sort of taking the blinkers off and putting yourself into more of a sort of carrier mindset, I would say, as well, to try to drive a better conversation. There will be some physical upsides, you know, if demand falls, that's not great for shippers, but then congestion will ease. And then hopefully, you know, this will also ease as well, because it came with all of those issues. So as those issues ease, you would hope this would ease as well.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, 100%. And I think what we also see on xChange, you know, it's you know, shippers and freight forwarders, and I think this is also what you mentioned as part of this, is really they're trying to gain control over a larger sort of part of their logistics supply chain, notably by using shipper-owned containers, by getting a better understanding of which regions, which ports show which demurrage and detention patterns, where do I need to manage what, where do I need to negotiate more free days in order to sort of stay competitive even after paying additional charges. We're of course happy to play a role in this, also by providing more transparency here through these reports, and potentially also a small feature on xChange where you can actually investigate demurrage and detention charges on your own. So certainly, the industry is waking up a little bit and understanding that they need to manage and control bigger parts of their supply chain. Cool. Perfect. I'm a little bit sort of mindful of time. So what I'd love to do is jump into the questions. Actually, Kai just asked, do we receive these notes after the meeting? And yes, you do. So we'll turn these sticky notes and of course the recording of this into a small package, and then we'll share it with the attendees and all the signups afterwards. Cool. Then let me go to Q&A. I'm actually not sure whether you can all see these Q&A these questions on the right hand side. If you can't, I'm just going to read them out real quick. Manish asks, signaling into you of surplus containers now exist in the global equipment pool. That was a figure also mentioned by Drewry just recently. What's the percentage due to idle vessel congestion, port skipping, dry dock, etc., etc.? So I assume that you mean how much of that is actually sort of tied up in the supply chain and is not lying around in depots. The figure I have, and then I'll let our experts speak, is that actually sort of the global supply chain has become 10 to 15% less efficient in terms of container usage, which equals out in roughly 5 to 6 million TEUs being tied up in that sort of distorted or disrupted supply chain. But happy for you, George, Chantal, add your thoughts and your comments.
Last I heard was 17%, I think, was the last number that somebody voted across my desk. So that sounds about in line, but I'm sure that Chantal will tell us both that we are far too low or far too high.
No, I think it probably sounds about right. I think, it's still too high. So...
Okay, perfect. And then we'll have sorry, I'm just started reading here. Ayush, can someone help me in finding the logic behind carriers introducing GRIs and PSS on India to North America trade, while prices continue their dip from North Asia and Southeast Asia? So it's about sort of price developments globally not being homogeneous. You know what I'm trying to say. I don't know, George. Is there anything in your data that could explain this?
I mean, the only logic that I can sort of add to this is going back to what we've already spoken about. It's an equipment imbalance, right? As with all these things, it's just additional charges that we start to see, and the market is subject to its own supply and demand balance. It's not just about the actual supply and demand of goods, of the actual contents of the containers, but of the containers itself. And so therefore that's the only logic that I can see that would put a PSS, a peak season surcharge, from India to North America, whilst the Trans-Pacific lane is seeing such a downside. That's the only thing I can think of that would do it, but I'm interested to see if anybody has any other views. But from my side, that's all I can think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It will be to do with the imbalance situation. And, you know, they don't, you know, not all trades act the same, and they have different drivers of demand. So, you know, it's not because one trade does one thing, another trade will do another. They do act very independently based on their own independent market forces, head haul and back haul. So that it's always worth keeping that in mind as well.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay. Hope this answers your question. And then we have Mohammed, who asks, what's your forecast, whether container prices will, where container prices will be end of 2023, so end of next year, in 1.5 years, when new containers will be delivered, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if Chantal or George, you have a crystal ball somewhere stowed away.
Well, we have. Do you mean freight rates, or do you mean actual cost of containers? I can answer freight rates.
Let's start with freight rates.
So we have the spot rate market, and then the contract rate market. And spot rate is definitely trending down. It's a definite trend. When you look at probably any index, it will show you it's on the downward go, and it has been since, I think, February. So, you know, the spot rate market is trending down. We expect contract rates to remain relatively high for this year. It will depend on when people start to run their bids for that. I think the additional vessel capacity coming in next year will definitely impact that. It will then come down to how carriers control the capacity and the allocations and the access to that. So I think we would expect to see a softening, but I would not expect anything to go back to pre-pandemic levels. But again, I'm going to caveat this with any disruption is going to drive it the opposite way. So that is the key to this. So as I said earlier, you know, until you start to see these indicators going from red to amber into green, then, you know, that's still going to be very much the controlling factor. And you can have another disruptor. What was it? Taiwan and China was mentioned not that long ago to me. So I'm not going to take a view on that, but you know, that could be another issue.
I think, you know, absolutely spot on with that we're talking about rates coming down. We're not going to see pre-pandemic levels. We're trending downwards, but it's not like a precipitous fall, as we know. But I'm fed up of saying the words black swan event in this market, because every time things start to improve, things start to go from red to amber, somebody crashes in the Suez Canal, or there's an outbreak somewhere, or whatever it may be. And I think the only thing that's certain in this market is that we're not done with all these issues that we're going to see. There's going to be something else, I think.
Yeah.
It pains me to say it. I'm sure we'll see something that will come out of the blue, and whether it's Taiwan or whether it's something that no one's thought about, the market's going to be, I'm sure, rocked by something interesting. Yesterday we were asked about the impact of climate change on disrupting supply chains. So, you know, wildfires, energy grids. I can't give an answer to that, but it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say it out loud, then it does impact it. That's my feeling on this sometimes. Just whisper it quietly and hope that no one's listening. Exactly. But people ask, you know, so all of, you know, the big item really coming towards the industry is sustainability and, you know, what's it going to be doing? IMO 2023, all of that. They're all things that will impact how the market moves. So, you know, I think nothing is off the table, really.
Yeah, Yeah, no, definitely. I think we can also at xChange we can echo that. When when 2020 when COVID hit, nobody knew what was coming. Everybody, the entire market was a little bit spooked. Then we saw that these disruptions really, or what kind of impact these disruptions really have. And then we've already touched upon the topic of polycrisis. It just kept piling crisis and issue and problem upon problem. And I think any crystal ball will have to have a crisis forecaster embedded. Cool. We are 1 minute sort of ahead of the end of this webinar. I'm aware that we're not able to answer all of these questions, but maybe one last question here from Ritika. Open question for the panel. How do you see the peak season unfolding for the container shipping industry? Is it true that the demand drop has started to ease off congestion at the ports in the US? I don't know if there's any view, maybe also distinguishing between East Coast and West Coast. Anything you can and want to comment on?
I would just say what peak season is the answer. We always say that rates go up quite a lot in this time of the year, but they're just not at the moment. Everyone's saying that peak season is going to be here. We're going to see that impact on rates. We haven't. But of course, with the slight easing in terms of demand, that should give logistics providers a little bit of a break. The void sailing, some of those ships are being taken out of loops and being used as sweeper vessels, trying to clear up some of the issues. But even if there's I firmly believe if nobody was to ship anything on a container in the next 6 months, we still wouldn't fix the issues that we've got in the market at this point. The market is really snarled up. And it's going to take a lot of effort to fix it. But I can see Chantal smiling, and I don't know whether that's at me or with me.
No, it's with you. It's also, I think you're right. The peak season, I think this year will be a bit different because of the massive inventory levels that have been building up. I think if you speak to a lot of shippers right now, they've got a lot sat in their warehouse that they need to move, and demand is falling. So they're feeling a little bit sort of reticent about all of that. And I think, the key to all of this is track port congestion, track the spot rate market, track the economic outlooks, gather your information. And, anyone who's putting out forecast, Drewry included, you say one thing one day and then something changes the next. So, arm yourselves with the knowledge on the key things that I think is key to all of this right now. So, but I would echo that on the peak season. I think as well, people, the timing of when people go to bid as well. I think last year people went early. The big guys went early. I think we're probably going to have a wait and see happen now because we have these downward ticks. So that will also that will impact how things start to fall. So if people are waiting or they go back to the traditional Transvac bid period, then that also makes a difference.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I think sort of just from our side to comment on this issue that George you have brought up. Even if nothing else will be shipped within the next 6 months, it would take a long time to clear up those congestions. We've always sort of compared it to a traffic jam, right? Even if if there's an accident and a traffic jam forms, even if the accident is sort of cleared up or pushed to the side of the road, it still takes very, very long for traffic to actually flow again normally, just because you have these knock-on effects. It's not the case that you just resolve the blockage and then everything flows as normal.
Yeah, and in the UK we try to implement smart motorways and the congestion is still there. So even in that instance, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
So the congestion stays, even with innovation, or not.
Exactly. Cool, perfect. Then I guess we're a little bit over time. I think this was a very, very good discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, Chantal, George, and of course, Candice. If you want to know more about Demurrage and Detention, feel free to download our report. We'll also share the recording of this webinar, and including all the sticky notes that I took here, and maybe with a bit of cleanup on wording, etc. We'll share that after the webinar. And hope to see and talk to you all very, very soon again. And have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.